Hoskins, author of War Cycles, Peace Cycles, on the topic of root of all evil. Mr. Hoskins.
The house I live in is not a very old house. It was the first house built in Lynchburg, Virginia after World War II, which makes it a real modern house. But the road itself is the old road that the British troops used to march up and down. Tom Jefferson's house is just up the road a little piece. And the Continental soldiers marched there, all the wagon trains going into our colonies and into our counties went right by our front door. Now, you wouldn't know that. It's got macadam on it, and it looks like any other road, but it's not. And we've got these big oaks. And all the oaks there are 120 years old. And why are they 120 years old? Well, that's when the owner of the plantation was killed. He was killed at Gettysburg. And there's nobody to take care of the plantation. It all grew up in oaks. And all the oak trees are 120 years old. Cut them down and count the rings. 120 years old, thereabouts. So it is just a little bit different. Now, you see the flag and everything. We're talking about July the 4th and all like that. I want to tell you just a little bit about what it was like back there then. There's hardly a person in here who doesn't have an ancestor who doesn't come from Virginia. There's hardly a person here who doesn't have an ancestor that didn't fight in that Revolutionary War. So just kind of erase everything that you've been told about Virginia. And I say Virginia because that was the biggest state there was. And out of Virginia, our counties were Kentucky, that was our county. West Virginia was a county. Ohio, Indiana, Michigan. We have a couple of other states that were counties settled by Virginians from Virginia. And so it's not like when I go into Michigan, Ohio, Indiana, or Wisconsin, like I'm going into a strange place. It's not. I'm going into part of Virginia. I really honestly feel that way inside. And people, I don't want to be offensive, but you know, it's sort of like coming home. And when those people come back to Lynchburg and other parts of Virginia, they're just coming home again. And it's a real good feeling we have. What was it like back there then? Well, on the economic front, we had the plantation system. Now, it's not like anything that you can imagine, the plantation system. It was a farm. Sure, it was a farm. A plantation was usually 1,000 acres. And why was it 1,000 acres? It's because 1,000 acres in Virginia could be operated efficiently on horseback. 2,000 acres was not very efficient. It meant that someone had too much land back there then. 500 acres was not efficient for a plantation. For a farm, yes, but for a plantation, no. Now, we had slaves. The reason we had slaves is because they were brought in on orders of the king. And why did the king order slaves to be brought to Virginia and sold there? It's because the king was in debt. He was in debt to the people who lent him money, the Jewish bankers in Holland. And he was hard put to pay his bills. Now we, on 2 or 3 separate occasions, petitioned the king not to allow strangers, now you're going to run across that name a lot of times, into our land. Why? Because it is forbidden for us to share our land with strangers. But we had to take them, and they were sold. And if the other plantation had slaves, he could outwork you and outproduce you. You had to have slaves. Now, Each plantation of 1,000 acres might have 20 slaves, 15 or 20 slaves. The plantation homes are not these great big places with the columns up the front. They were cottages, most of them. A story and a half, and they had 3 dormers in the front. They had a basement they used for a root cellar. How many of you know what a root cellar is? Well, good. I'm glad that we are on that wavelength anyway right now. All of our homes had root cellars. Half of it was a kitchen. We had bricks laid down, and in bad weather we'd eat there or warm up food. The other half was just dirt. And everyone came in there and said, oh, the cellar's not finished. Of course it wasn't finished. It was a root cellar. You had to put your vegetables right on the ground so they wouldn't spoil. Any other way, they'll rot on you. And you had to live off of it. Now, we had problems with slaves from the very first time they came in. Number one, the covenant that we live under is this: I will put my laws in your hearts, and you will be my people, and I will be your God. Now that is for the Israel people. There are other races that do not have the law in their hearts. They are nice people, they're delightful people. I personally like blacks. I've been raised among them, I've had dealings with them, I know how to handle most of them. Some of them you have a great deal of difficulty for anyone to handle. And so we get along. However, we have certain things that we separate on. Number one is you don't put temptation in the front of a black, because he's just liable to kick over the traces. Oftentimes, oh, fine. Yeah, I'm not loud. Can you all hear me in the back? We had laws passed against racial interbreeding at a very, very early stage. We were one of the states that did it. Massachusetts did it. New York did it. Every one of the original 13 states had laws against racial interbreeding. Now, around the plantation farm, we had satellite farms. The plantation would specialize in wheat or tobacco or cotton or whatever it was, or sorghum. The satellite farms around each plantation did the things that the plantation did not do. So in other words, now just picture this in your mind. You have a plantation of 1,000 acres with a cottage, they call a plantation house, with around the plantation forges, barns, storage places, all sorts of places for making harness, wagon works, so forth and so on, needed right there to keep things going. A weaving room and things like that. Every plantation was that way. There was a plantation house every mile. Around the periphery of the plantation were the satellite farms, and they took care of the things that the plantation did not take care of. They took care of, it might be making wagons. It might be making harnesses. It might be forge work, or it might be any one of a dozen things. Now, the satellite farms, everybody was kin. Everybody in Virginia was kin to everybody else. The son of a satellite farm might marry the daughter of the plantation owner. It happened all the time. And not only was this plantation group kin, but it was kin to other groups around. And everyone spent all their time figuring out how they were kin, and they still do that in Virginia. Is your name such and such? Are you from so-and-so? Well, I knew your so-and-so, you know. You've heard your mother and daddy do that often enough. Well, it became a very real thing. We were very close kin in Virginia. We did not lose contact with you when you went out to Ohio and Michigan or down into Tennessee or over to Texas. We didn't lose contact. After the war between the states, it was awfully bad in Virginia, awfully bad. And my grandfather, he had to move away to make a living. He moved to Missouri. He met my grandmother there. My grandmother came from the same county he came from, within 2 miles of where he lived, and they were second cousins. And they had never met before. They met in Missouri and then moved back to Virginia, you see. We try to move back if we can, you know. Now, in 1775, we were not allowed to make a hat. We were not allowed to make a plow by law. We were not allowed to make any casting or anything out of iron. We couldn't make clothing of a fancy type that was sold in stores by law. All of that had to be imported from England. And that made us very, very angry, because the English charged us 3 different prices for everything we bought from them. Our big thing was, of course, in Virginia, tobacco. They took our tobacco, raised the price 6 times, and sold it. They were getting wealthy in England, and we were very, very poor, relatively speaking, in England and in Virginia. But what really made us poor was this. We had taxes. The taxes were used to pay the king's indebtedness to his bankers. Now, we produced a lot of things in Virginia. We produced corn, we produced wheat, we produced cotton, we produced tobacco, but we did not produce gold and silver coins. And that's what they wanted to be paid in. It got to a point at one time that if you didn't come up with the right kind of coins, they would take your land and sell it, foreclose it, for the right kind of coins. You could have given them tobacco, you could have given them cotton, but they didn't want that. They wanted a certain type of coin. They stopped that after a while. In order to get around this real bad situation we had in Virginia, we resorted to smuggling. Our ships, our coastal ships from the tidewater rivers, went down to Mexico, loaded with tobacco and cotton. And they came back with plows, with clothing, they came back with leather goods, all sorts of things that they produced down in Mexico. Strictly illegal. The English warships were around trying to stop the trade all the time, but we had to do it. We really couldn't afford the prices that the English made us pay. Now, when we first got started in Virginia, it was a real paying proposition. And fact of the matter is, you can go through the countryside of Virginia today and look at the old houses, and practically all of them were built in a certain age. The very earliest houses were built anywhere between 1615 to about 1680. That was a profitable time during that time. Then we had a period that was very profitable from about 1710 to about 1740, and most of the other houses were built during that period. Then we had another profitable period 100 years later from about 1810 to about 1850, a 40-year period of time, and the rest of the houses were built there, of the fine houses. They were wealthy times. But we had in England something that was established in 1692, I believe it was. It was the Bank of England. And when they founded the Bank of England, it started a whole new ballgame. The Bank of England, in a short period of time, lent money to everyone they could in England on the 10 for 11 basis. Now, This is one fundamental thing I want you to get and grab and run with. Now, if there's $10, and that's all there is in the whole wide world, just $10, and someone lends it to you under condition that you repay 11, you can't do it because 11 doesn't exist. Now, you have had it. From that time on, you have had it. The contract doesn't say that you can pay back $10 and a bushel of wheat, or $10 and 10 pounds of gold, or $10 and a horse. The contract says you got to pay back $11. And if $11 doesn't exist anywhere, you can't do it, and therefore you go into default or bankruptcy. Now, there have been a lot of things they've added to it, a lot of bells and whistles to make it sound better and make you think that you can get out from under it. But there's no way to do it. Now, this is called the Babylonian monetary system. It's just that simple. There's nothing complicated about it. Everybody tries to make it just real complicated, and it's not complicated at all. One of the first things they did, they said, you come to the bank and say, hey, I'm real sorry. I did the very best I could this last year, but I got a ship line, and I bought 5,000 acres of land, 2,000 slaves, and I'm trading like crazy, but somehow or another I can't get hold of $11. I only got 10. Have it let me borrow $1 and to pay you, you see. Just tide me over to next year when things are better. So the banker said, all right, since you're such a nice fella, I'll tell you what I'm going to do. I'm going to let you borrow another $1. Now you owe me $11 and got to pay me back 12, right? And he does the same thing the next year, and he owes $12, got to pay him back 13, and it goes on and on and on. And at any time he wants, the banker can foreclose and take everything the man's got. And that is called the usury system. England started that starting in the early 1700s, and it spread all over England. They also set up a Bank of Scotland in about 1695, I think, or 94. I think my dates are right. And it spread all over Scotland. Now, I've been to Scotland, and lots of you, how many people here have kin who came from Scotland a long time ago? Well, that's most of you. All right, now, this is how it is, and this is how it was in Scotland. I went out, and I could look down from one of these mountains, and I could see what had been villages out there. You know, I could tell the foundations of the old houses. There weren't any houses there. I could tell where the old roads were that were put in cobblestones. Nobody went up and down those roads. There were no houses there. The little cottages out, I could see where they were by the foundations. They weren't there. And what happened? The farmers borrowed $10 from the Bank of England and were required to pay back $11. And then when they couldn't pay, they were foreclosed. Now, two things happened that were very, very important to Virginia. First was a war, 1715, Scotland and England. The second one was the Second War, 1745. Scotland lost both of them. They took the Scottish prisoners of war and put chains around their necks and took them down to Yorktown, Virginia. The slave ships would come in, and they would sell them. Now, I mean, these were our granddaddies I'm talking about. They sold them into slavery for 7 years, a 7-year indenture. And why 7 years? Because the law says you can only sell one of your own kind for 7 years. That's all. To a stranger, a Zwer stranger, a racial alien, you can put him in perpetual slavery, but not to your own kind. Now, these Scottish prisoners, your grandfathers, they were standing on the block. They'd been in the hold of a ship several months, and they hadn't had a bath, and I don't know when, and their uniforms were in tatters and everything. And the Plantation owners bought them because they were cheap and put them to work out in the fields hoeing corn. But they heard something very interesting. On occasion, the prisoners would speak to each other in Latin or Greek or Hebrew. Now these are your grandfathers I'm talking about. Why were these Scots speaking these strange classical languages? It's because most of them knew it. Back in Scotland, Scotland was an awfully poor country, very, very poor indeed. And the clan chieftains, in order to do the best they could for their own kin, imported the best teachers in the whole world. And if you had it in you to learn, you got as much education as you could take. Latin, Greek, Hebrew, mathematics, you name it. That little old sheep herder with a sheepskin on him, up on top of one of those Scottish mountains with sheep all around him, was probably doing his Latin for a test that was coming up. He probably knew more than about 10 times than I do right now. Far better educated. So these plantation owners, or these English plantation owners, my name is Hoskins, English. My grandmother was a Hume, Scot. I have another grandmother, Roy, Scot, another grandfather, Duncan, Scot, and Dunbar, Scot. So I've got a lot of Scots in my background too. Virginia is a blend of the two. They took these people in and said, hey, they're wasted out there in the field hoeing corn with a black. So let them set up a school. And they did. Every plantation had its own school. Might be a humble thing. Usually it was the attic of the plantation house, centrally located. And everybody did walk a mile to school, or at least a half a mile from the satellites. And everybody went that could possibly do it. Overseers, or every person on the plantation that could take an education did. All right, now what did these Scots teach these Americans, colonists? And we're talking about 1750, 1760 now. You see, we're getting right close to the time of the war. They taught them Latin and Greek and Hebrew and their sums and mathematics. And they taught them to say, there's a mouse about the house, and there's no doubt about it. And we in Virginia still say that. While the English said there's a mouse about the house, and there's no doubt about it, you know. It's sort of an alien tongue to us. And we made a point of saying there's a mouse about the house. You see, that made us different from the English. And we wanted to make sure the English knew that we were different from them. Here I am talking about my own ancestors who were English. But at this moment, I happen to be a very loyal Scottish nationalist. They also taught George Washington and Tom Jefferson and Patrick Henry to hate the guts out of the English. You see, when the Scottish lost their wars in Scotland, it won a war here in America. It made America possible. America was flooded with Scottish, not prisoners of war, but workers, small farmers who were bankrupted off their lands. Their lands were taken from them. Now let me tell you how that works. There is no Mr. Bad. It is the bank who does it to you. But who owns the bank? The stockholders. And when your place comes up for auction, or the Scottish homes came up for auction, at 5 shillings on the pound, or 5 pence on the pound, or 10 cents on the dollar, who bought it? It was usually a bank, a front, but who ended up owning it? It was the stockholders of the banks. Now, this caused a lot of ill feeling toward banks and bank stockholders. Now, we had no banks in America. I bet many of you didn't know that. There were several reasons we didn't, but we didn't have a single bank in the United States. In 1780, we had 2. In 1800, we had maybe 20. By about 1830, we had maybe 400. And then they just exploded. By 1931, we had 31,076 banks. And then they bankrupted down and merged down until we had about 14,000, which is about the number we have today. Now, that is a separate story that I'd like to go into later on. The growth of banks, it's something brand new in our history. We did what we did without them. We contracted without loans. We lent money without taking a person for everything he had. We got along very well here in the early days of our existence. Now, politically, oh goodness, I understand that I have to quit exactly at the right time or they're going to, where's that rope? So, we're coming right down to 11 minutes, so I'm going to talk real fast, and what I don't hit right now, I'll go into this afternoon. Because I think it's just real interesting to know where you came from and what it was like and what your granddaddies went through. Because you are not going through one solid thing that they didn't go through. And how they solved it might be an answer to how we're going to solve our problems in the days ahead. Now, politically, what was the situation politically? The king was in debt, and he had to pay his bills. So we had taxes, very unpopular taxes. Everything was taxed. Every single thing was taxed. You couldn't even file a bill at the court without paying a tax, a shilling, to get a certificate from a university to show that you had graduated. Was a pound. To have it in a foreign language was 2 pounds. A deck of playing cards might be 10 shillings. Everything you did was taxed, and you didn't have any money. There was no money, and if you didn't have any money, you couldn't buy. The merchants couldn't sell, and you couldn't buy, and England didn't give a doggone. They didn't care. They had to pay, the crown had to pay its bills, and they had to get its money. And it didn't make any difference if everything shut down, and shut down it did. Now, don't get the idea that we were all raving rebels, although we have a history of being rebels in Virginia. We were the king's subjects. We were loyal Englishmen, all of us. But we were being abused unmercifully. And so it came down to a point in time whether you were either for the king and what he was doing, or you were for one of the enforcement committees. And an enforcement committee was a group of individuals who swore that we wouldn't do any business at all with England until they became more agreeable or more lenient. And if you did do business with England, there was the devil to pay. Right next to Hoskins Creek on the Rappahannock is a town called Tappahannock. And Tappahannock's an old town. We used to own that land there a long time ago. And a town grew up there. And they had some merchants there. In 1775, the town was a whale lot bigger than it is right now. And one of the biggest houses on Main Street, and the big houses then weren't big like you think as being big today. The big house was 2 cottages end to end. You see, they had 1 cottage with 3 dormers. On the end of that, they built another cottage, so they had 6 dormers in the front, which was a big house for Tappahannock. The man who owned that house had a fleet of ships out in the Rappahannock River. And he didn't care. He had to pay his seamen, and he was going to ship to England, and he didn't care what anybody did. And one morning, a knock came at the door, and he looked out the window, and it was dark. And there, all up and down the street, were great long lines of men holding torches, burning torches. No one said a word. And he came to the front door, and nobody was there. Just those long lines of men with torches. Absolute silence. And he closed the door, and he went back to bed, and his ships did not go to England. Because if he had, I think there had been the mischief to pay. People had reached the point that they were panicky. That was the enforcement committees. If you bought anything from a merchant that was made in England, you could be tarred and feathered. And most of you don't know what tarring and feathering is, but you'll probably see it again sometime in your lifetime. When you take warm tar and put it on someone, it's almost impossible to get off. And when you put feathers on it, it is a mess that's unbelievable. It really is. And it is only done to people who have done just the most awful thing indeed. And it is done, and it has been done century in and century out ever since our people came to the United States. We're too civilized for that today, 1985. Now I wonder what 1987 or 1988 will hold for that custom. 1988, excuse me. Religious. What was the religion like in Virginia? Well, we had one religion, just one. It was the Church of England. Now, who was the head of the Church of England? The king. It was an episcopacy. Now, what does that mean? It means that the king appoints his wheels, and those wheels appoint their wheels, and their wheels appoint their wheels, you see, from the top down. And then there were the dissenters. The dissenters were these outrageous groups that nobody in their right mind belonged to. Baptists, Methodists, Presbyterian, you know, those types. Nobody belonged to those groups, the dissenters. Now, they practiced a different type. They had what they call a presbytery. Now, they elected their officials. Who elected their officials? Who elected their officials? From the bottom up. Diametrically opposite from the king. The king, who was the head of the Church of England, looked on the presbyters and said, hey, they are in revolt against me. Put them down. And they would, by law, put down. And they were really put down. I'll give you a case in point. In 1764, over in Bowling Green, that's a county right over from Essex County, where our people came from, in the jailhouse there. Now, something about jails. We didn't have very many jails. In the early days, we didn't have any at all. But we did have a holding tank, a holding jail to hold a prisoner for trial. And it was just a temporary thing for 3, 4, 5 days until they got hold of the dissenters. When they got hold of the dissenters, they didn't know what to do with them. You see, there weren't any real laws about them, so they put them in there and threw the keys away. At one time, there were 5 Baptist preachers, 1764, in the jail at Bowling Green. And they were preaching through the bars. And the bars were different. Instead of just going up and down like the bars do today, they went this way and this way. And each preacher took his time at the window. And crowds of people would meet out there, of dissenters. And frankly, the Church of England people, they went to church and everything, but they weren't all that good, churchgoers. But the interesting thing is this, that whether you were Church of England or whether you were a dissenter, you still were a son of your fathers. And your fathers knew Latin and Greek and Hebrew, and guess what you knew? You knew Latin and Greek and Hebrew. And that makes a whale of a lot of difference when it comes to understanding the Bible. They accepted as matter of course things that we think are just something really, really great, you know. This identity thing everybody's doing backflips over. Who cares? I mean, after you've talked about it 10 minutes, you know, what else are you going to talk about? How about let's talk about the rest of the Bible, and that'll take the rest of your lifetime, you know, to talk about that. So that's what they spent the time in doing. When you ran into a word that might cause difficulty, like the word stranger, it's in one case you run up to a man and throw your arms around him and kiss him both cheeks. Stranger. The next time you run up to a man, haul off and bust him in the mouth. Stranger. Now there's a lot of difference. Why in one case would you hug and kiss somebody and the next time you'd haul off and hit him? The use of the word. One case it would be the word zwar, racial alien, translated out stranger, and the other case would be ger, G-E-R, Hebrew words, translated out racial kinsman. You had different treatment with different things. And our grandfathers had no problems with it. They knew how to read these things in the original, you see. You didn't fool them. There was no such thing as a preacher getting up and snowing his congregation and telling them all sorts of things that weren't true, because the congregation was as smart as he was. And these things were taken as a matter of course. Now, I appreciate you putting up with me right now, and I'm going to have to cut it off right now because I've been told at 9:30 I'm supposed to shut up. So 9:30 is here, and I'll be back with you this afternoon. Thank you.